In this session, as promised, I will talk about Africa in the war, and beyond that, some of the consequences of the war for Africa. In the first place, Africans fought directly in Europe during the war. Again, we don't know this. Most of us don't know this. And it certainly wouldn't be important if we did, right? The reality is that the French conscripted over 500,000 African troops for its war in Europe. 211,000 troops from Western and Equatorial Africa, the parts of Africa that the French controlled in the central region of Africa, and over 270,000 troops from northern Africa, from the colonies that France held, principally Algeria, in the northern part of Africa. I think I've got a photograph here. These are Senegalese troops, West African troops, fighting on the Western Front during World War I. Of these 500,000 troops, African troops, approximately 200,000, 2 out of every 5 African troops, lost their lives in the service of the French. More important, Africa was necessarily the number of the scene of a number of important campaigns in the war, and Africans controlled by the French fought against Africans controlled by the Germans, each in the service of their own respective colonial master. In Western Africa, British and French troops, that is to say, Africans controlled by British people and African troops controlled by French people, joined in attacking the German colony of Togo. And there they fought Africans wearing German uniforms under the command of German officers, and they quickly overran the German forces in Togo. But it took the British and the French nearly 2 years to do the same in the German colony of Cameroon, Equatorial Africa, the western coast of Equatorial Africa. Britain's colony of South Africa attacked the Germans in the German colony of Southwest Africa, present-day Namibia. So again, Africans fighting with British uniforms against Africans fighting in German uniforms. In battling the Germans in East Africa, the British recruited as many as 1 million Africans to serve as porters for the British. Of this 1 million force of porters, people who carried supplies, of this 1 million African force of porters, as many as 100,000, 1 out of every 10, were killed in military actions or were killed as a result of hunger or disease attendant to the war. In addition, in the campaigns in Cameroon and Eastern Africa, villages were often burned to the ground, food supplies requisitioned by the marauding armies on one side or the other, leaving the people who had grown that food without resources to survive. And in accord with the colonialism's general purpose, Europe's African colonies would be forced to pay for the war. That is, a portion of the colony's tax burden was channeled to meet war needs in Europe as well as in Africa. And the colony's tax burden during the war years being intensified, made worse than it had been previously. Moreover, in vigorously recruiting among African populations for service in World War I, the war disrupted daily life in Africa, and it took young men who otherwise would be working to sustain their families and brought them to distant parts of the world. War results. As a result of the war, Germany lost all its colonies, and if I'm not mistaken, the bulk of those colonies was in Africa. These colonies, nominally in name, became League of Nations mandate territories. That is to say, they were being held by this pan-European body, the League of Nations, ostensibly, again, as with colonialism in general, in the interest of developing these people along civilized lines, training them in the arts of civilization and so on and so forth, but in reality becoming British or French or Belgian colonies. The British got the bulk of German East Africa. The Belgians took the German colonies of Rwanda and Burundi. The British annexed the western part of Cameroon and added it to their Nigerian colony, while the French took the remainder of Cameroon and added it to its French Equatorial Africa colony. South Africa by then a combined British-Dutch colony, independent of Britain, nominally at least independent of Britain, but run by the settlers. It's a settler colony, and it's run by the British and the Dutch. The British settlers and the Dutch settlers. They take the formerly German colony of German Southwest Africa, now called Namibia, and the British and the French divided up the German colony of Togo. The second result of the war, after we look at the seizure of the German colonies and their redivision amongst the British and the French and the Belgians. Secondly, the war also marked a still greater consolidation of European control over the colonies. So, for example, because trade with the colonies had to accord with war needs, the British and the French emphasized trade in raw materials at the expense of trade in agricultural goods such as cocoa or groundnuts. To control this trade, then, the British, for example, issued licenses to trading companies with appropriate quotas for colonial goods. And if you didn't produce what these trading companies were asking for, you weren't going to get paid. And if you didn't get paid, you couldn't pay your taxes. If you couldn't pay your taxes, you were in trouble. Effectively, this eliminated most of the remaining African traders and importers in Africa. Third, the demands of the war on Britain and France pushed these two colonizing nations to deepen their exploitation of African resources. Specifically, for example, both Britain and France conducted vast geological surveys of their African colonies, looking to find minerals for their respective war efforts. So the British, for example, found in the Gold Coast colony, today's Ghana, found in the Gold Coast colony extensive deposits of manganese and bauxite, with the former particularly important in the production of, the highest grade steel. With that, I will conclude this session, and we will continue in the next with a discussion about probably the one consequence of the First World War not fully anticipated by the colonizing or appreciated by the colonizing nations, and that is the growth of an African nationalism within the colonies during the war years.